Thank you and good morning. It is a packed house. I can only assume the air conditioning is not working in some of your buildings. So hopefully we didn't design those. About 3 months ago, I suppose, Farah approached me with the black dot and said, Julian, wouldn't you really like to do one of these breakfast talks? It's your turn. Farah asked you that sort of question in a way you really can't say no, actually. There is no option. You might as well just give in graciously and agree to do it. She then said, well, can you put together an outline of what you're going to talk about so I can have a title and we can send it round to people? So I said, fine. 2 or 3 weeks later, I went back to her with my outline of a presentation and went through it slowly. She tutted, wrinkled her nose, said, you don't really get it. This is meant to be humorous and non-technical. That sort of stopped me in my tracks, to be quite honest, because those who know me think probably humour and non-tech isn't actually what I do. And I thought, how can I explain this to Farah? That, I'm a old dyed-in-the-wool engineer. So I remembered a very old joke, and this joke actually was doing the rounds when I was at university. And there's 2 engineering undergraduates in the bar and sipping their pint of Old Peculiar. And the first says to the second, I had a very funny start to the day. And the second says, well, why was that? I was walking across the park into campus, and this gorgeous girl was riding towards me on a bicycle. Just before she got to me, she jumped off the bike, ripped all her clothes off, lay on the grass, and said, take whatever you want. So did you? You bet. It's got 18 gears, a carbon frame. It's locked up outside. Farah mentioned I've been here sort of 30 years, and we were going to have a slide that just said, 30 years at Arup, gosh, what have you done for all that time? Aren't you bored? What's happened? What's changed? And instead of which, we thought we'd use some slides. And I only reflected on this perhaps last night when we were looking at this slide. That probably one of the biggest things that's changed across these 3 buildings, and not the buildings themselves, but the way we work. First one, 11 The Strand, which was a second project I ever worked on in Arup with Cass & Conda Partnership. And it was a very traditional architect's role. They were the project manager. They were pretty much the only people who spoke to the client. They beat up the contractor. And so it went on. But it got built. The second, Stockley Park, was probably the first major project I worked on where the construction manager was really leading the project. The architects and the engineers were all very much managed by the CM, and the CM definitely had the client's ear. And the final one, which is where we are now, the noughties, well, we started work on it in the noughties, Leadenhall project, and perhaps where we should have been 30 years ago, with a much more collaborative approach where we started off in a fairly traditional role, working for British Land as the architect and engineering designers. And then following the appointment of Langer Rourke, we've been novated to them, so we're now working for the contractor. And I honestly believe the things that have been achieved on Leadenhall would never have been achieved with either of the other 2 previous contractual arrangements. Actually, the benefit of the designers and the contractors working together as a team far outweighs any possible disbenefit one might have. And the second thing, why I've been here and enjoyed being here with people, well, this is a selection of some of the architects I've worked with, some of the firms, some of the other firms of architects, some of the suppliers, and then the projects. Lots in UK. My very first ever project when I started was the Britannia Leisure Centre in Hackney. We didn't put a photograph up of it because it looks rather like a green shed, and in fact it is a green shed. Interesting story though. I'd been in Arup for, I don't know, 6 or 8 weeks working, and the associate I was working for said, right, you should go to site. So I put my tie on, put my jacket on, got my nice new leather briefcase that my mum had bought me before I started at Arup. And he looked at me and said, what do you think you're doing? It's Hackney, you'll never make it to the site if you go like that. 11 The Strand, the second project I worked on, I mentioned earlier. And this taught me something about sometimes the fact that even in a fairly adversarial project, there can be quite a lot of humour. And I walked into a site meeting one morning to find all of the contractors standing up against the wall like this. What are you doing? He said, we're just following your engineer's instruction. says quite clearly, all contractors should be screwed to the wall. That's misspelling before we had word processing. 11 The Strand. I spent nearly 10 years of my life working on this. First the Regalian building, then the shell and core, and then the fit-out. Main claim, Maggie Thatcher as a client, and the only project I've ever worked on that's been in 2 James Bond films. Foundress Court at Pembroke College, Cambridge, which I worked on with Eric Parry. And this was really very enlightening, both from the client and working with Eric Parry, who used to teach at Cambridge. I'm not sure if he still does. But it was absolutely fascinating to see the approach of the client, who started out by saying things like, we've been here for 500 years and we don't see why we shouldn't be here for another 500. And as you look around the room, some of them did look like they had been there the whole 500 years. But Eric was incredibly methodical, and he was extremely good at explaining the architectural history that was behind the design. And I think probably it did it on that building much better than any other building I've ever worked on. And finally, the Olympic Village. This was really just great fun, actually. It was really nice having a deadline that was absolutely set in stone. It could not be finished by the Olympics. And working at the same time with 6 or 7 different architects with basically the same brief and producing similar but noticeably different buildings. So then the towers, things that I say we're going to learn from. The map shows the countries where not only have I worked on towers but have visited and actually been to the site, clients. There's a lot more where, unfortunately, I've worked on them and you win a competition that goes away and you may not ever get to visit it. Starting with Leadenhall, magnificent building, something I think everybody who's working on this, whether that be the trade contractors, the architects, the engineers, are immensely proud of. Slightly odder example, Sports City Tower in Doha. The reason depth for this tower was actually the bit at the top, which had flames coming out of it for the Asian Games. The height was determined by it being higher than the last Asian Games. Most of this building has absolutely nothing. There is just core. There are no floor plates. However, one thing I learned from this building sways rather a lot because there's very little to stop it swaying. And when people talk to you about lift shafts having to be vertical and plumb and perpendicular and putting laser lines up, when the wind blows, the top of these lift shafts aren't even physically above the bottom. They sway completely. And yet they still run. Grandeur West Tower. This is one of the towers I'll talk a little bit more about in a little while. Fantastic project we did with Wilkinson Air. We won a design competition and then it got on through and built and is now constructed. And one of the problems on working on these super tall towers is probably half of them that you work on never get off the ground. The Renzo Piano Landmark Tower in Yongsan, and again I'll talk a little more about this. It is incredibly slender and again we'll talk a bit about why that really matters. And finally ADIC, 2 towers in Abu Dhabi. And this is probably the first tower which I worked on that really has been driven by the desire to minimise energy. The whole of this facade is mobilised, it opens, it closes. You know, a huge investment in the facade to minimise energy. So the name of this lecture was Tall Buildings, and then you might say, well, actually, it's all very interesting, these super tall buildings. We're not likely to build any of those in London. So maybe we can talk why. A number of years ago, I was working with Stuart Lipton, both on Stockley Park and other projects. And he was very clear. He said, when a tenant comes into a building, all they've got to look at is the lifts, the loos, and the lobbies. Typical shell and core building. He also asked me to look at what happens if we just keep building higher. So you take a building and you extrude it up. What happens to the percentage of total floor area that your lifts are going to occupy? And that too, inexorably, just continues up. But then there's these couple of odd little areas of why should it suddenly fall? And those are actually caused by the desire of most people designing buildings to have as few groups as lifts as possible. So if you can, get away with it, we'll have a group of lifts and it'll serve all 15 floors and that's great. And eventually you get to a point where you just can't do that and you have to have low-rise and high-rise lifts. But this graph actually suggests that's probably not the most efficient way of doing things. So if we come back to Grandeur West, one of the nice things about this picture is it illustrates very clearly where the sky lobbies are. The 2 office sky lobbies and at the top the hotel sky lobby. As I say, we won this in competition with Wilkinson Air. We'd spent probably 3 months working on, or I'd spent 3 months just working on the core with the team, and the guys from Wilkinson Ayres were also just working on the core, that particular part of the team. And we came up with a fairly complicated solution that worked quite well. We have local lifts around the outside, we have shuttle lifts in the middle, there's hotel shuttle lifts as well as goods lifts, VIP lifts and all the other good things. Fortunately, we went to the very first meeting, having won the competition with the client, and he said, don't want sky lobbies, don't want double-deck lifts, I just want all my lifts to start from the bottom and go up. Away and redesign it. And no amount of trying to persuade him that that wasn't a good idea, and eventually one of my colleagues from Hong Kong kicked me under the table and said, no, you don't understand China, just shut up and go and do what you're told. So we did, and we came back, and unfortunately, if you take that approach with a building of this height, the lift cores and lobbies alone occupy 97% of the floor plate. At which point, there's no people, so you don't need any lifts, so you're in a conundrum that you can't go round and round in circles. So eventually, as you saw from the photographs, they agreed that we should have sky lobbies and double decks and local lifts, and so it was. And that's a rather marvellous building. On then to Yongsan Tower. And this is a shard, which we know and love in London. And just for comparison, the same architect, the same team, just a rather taller one. And interesting to note that actually the base dimensions aren't terribly different, even though the height is twice that of the shard. I went to the very first meeting with Renzo Piano with a set of sort of standard solutions that you have for super high-rise office buildings. This is all office, it's over 100 floors of offices. And they looked at them and they had a look and they said, no, but Julian, you don't understand the core of this building. And this is sort of a simplification of the core, demonstrating just the lifts. Interestingly, these are all the passenger lifts. These 8 lifts, or those cores, are the only ones that actually make it from the top to bottom, because as the building tapers, you would end up outside of the building in any other location. So we had to work on a solution for a 100-storey building with basically just 8 passenger lift shafts. We added shuttles around the outside because they drop off as you get to the sky lobbies. To compare that, if you look at a similar building, Sears Tower is also 100 floors of offices, and its core, the equivalent of the group of 8 that we have are 24, and again with 2 groups of sky lobbies. So then how could we manage to reduce the 24 or 30 typically that you have in a building for the local lifts to just 8? And the simple answer was we had to put 64 lifts into those 8 shafts. We used twin lifts from Thyssen, which are 2 independently moving. They're not quite the same as double decks, and in fact were key to this project to allow actually the whole system to work. One of the problems we have with these stacked lifts, one above the other, is here we have a sky lobby, we've got the lifts coming down below, we've got the lifts going to above. Unfortunately, this lift needs an overrun and a machine room, a control room, and this one needs a lift pit. And we end up with 3 or 4 floors below each sky lobby, which can't be served. Typically, on tall buildings with a single sky lobby, they just fill that up with plant and it's all is well. On Yongsan, because we needed 3 at least, and possibly 4 sky lobbies, we'd have far too much space for the plant if we did that. So we used the twin lifts so that at each of the sky lobby locations, some of the lifts went down and tessellated, so we ended up with no unserved floors. So the lessons we learned from this from tall buildings really is core is king. And some of the structural engineers who I've worked on now with 2 or 3 tall buildings, including BVA and in Mexico and Yongsan and now Bogota, have come to realise that they said, Julian, you go to the first meetings, there's not really any point us talking to the architect until you've sorted out what you're doing with the lifts. Then they'll come along and we'll work around it, because it really does control to such a huge degree how these tall buildings will work. No white space. In cores, there shouldn't be any space that's not working, that's not earning its money. The idea of having an access space in front of a riser, absolute anathema. That's just wasted space. And finally, that getting your zoning right is crucial to making those buildings work. Okay, then, so that's fine. We can do 600-metre tall buildings, and the technology is wonderful, and we're jolly clever. How does that apply to buildings which we might more typically see in London? And here we have 24,000 square metre gross area, 18,000 net, 15-storey office building. reasonably typical. Certainly plenty of examples around, a bit taller, a bit shorter. We can use 8 lifts in a single core, and they serve all floors. Meets BCO, 15% handling capacity, waiting times less. Great. Job done, let's walk away. Finished. But I'm suggesting we shouldn't, because actually that core is really very flabby. It's unnecessarily using resource and space. Why not zone? We've seen in the tall high-rise buildings you have to zone. There is no option. Why? But why not do it on these shorter buildings? Typically we might be approached by letting agents who say, no, but in this building we could have a single tenant and they'll occupy the whole space, and then they won't want to have to change from the high-rise lifts. And if they put the meeting room, they can't get to it without going to the ground and then changing and going back up again. Well, actually, that's not true. I could also use the stairs, but we're not suggesting they should do that. What we should be doing is using the sort of technology that's available and using it more sensibly. So destination control, those of you know in this building that we have it. It's not really necessary. It's very nice for me, though, to be able to demonstrate it to people without having to wander around London. And take those 8 lifts and redefine them as 2 groups of 4, but not physically, just electronically. So as you approach the main lobby in the morning, if you're working in the bottom half of the building, you will always be assigned to cars A, B, C or D, because those only go halfway up the building. If you work at the top half of the building, you'll always be assigned to the other 4. Still looks the same as our normal group of 8. However, during the day, those 8 high-rise lifts also have stops at the low-rise floors, so your interfloor traffic is not an issue. So, well, that's all very good, but, what are we really going to get out of it? Well, actually, capital costs saved by that simple, 840,000 on this project. The doors alone, by not having all 8 lifts serving all 15 floors, £440,000. The low-rise lifts can be slower, saving another 400,000. And finally, by not taking the lifts up the top, we reduce the size of the core. The core needs to be designed properly so that does realise rentable space. But on this building, about another 200,000 per annum rent at a rent of £50 a square foot. So that's one of the sort of very simple lesson that we can take from the high-rise buildings, apply to these sorts of buildings, and you can see the sort of savings that can be made. But there's, I think, probably more. Typically in London, we all get fascinated by the 9 o'clock arrival. As you probably all realise, none of you have arrived at work at 9 o'clock, or not yet. Actually, what does happen in London is people have lunch. And we should really be moving away from this designing for this mythical 9 o'clock start. It doesn't happen. There's 15% handling capacity. We measured our building across the road. We peaked at 4, is the peak arrival rate in the morning. We should make use of the technology, the incredible power we have in things like destination control. There's an iPhone, pretty common, pretty cheap, fairly available. It actually has more computing power than NASA had available when they were doing the total computing power they had available when they were doing the moon launches. We're all used to the idea that Formula One increasingly pushes technology and comes up with wonderful ideas. And actually things like ABS brakes came from that, and now we just accept it. Who would think of not buying a car with ABS brakes? 30 years ago, not possible. So what I'm really saying is we should embrace the technology and the way that people have to work incredibly hard on high-rise buildings such as this. This is Leadenhall. Rather nice graphic. Thank you, Rogers, for providing us with this. And we should make sure we end up with no flabby cores. Thank you.
I thought the animations were fantastic. Who did those? I'd like to know. Yeah, I mean, I'm very interested in lifts. We're doing a tall building ourselves, but I sort of came away feeling these tall buildings are incredibly inefficient in many ways, and certainly the super tall ones. I was gobsmacked at the sheer amount of the floor space that was used for lifts and the cores. So I think that was my main thing. But always great. Love these over talks.
Fascinating. I think the bit that I gleaned from that is looking at lessons learnt on tall buildings and how you can then apply them to perhaps the lower rise buildings, which seems to be the way that perhaps Grosvenor and some of the mid-rise buildings that we look at. So there's some interesting thoughts to take away.
Fantastic, really informative. I think you got the balance between fun and information correct. He was obviously gagging to do a bit more technical stuff, but I know it's great. It's really good, and I think people know there's enough stuff there. If they want to go back and talk to Julian about the more techie stuff, they can do. But it's really good, really good.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. It was good. It was more technical, even though you told him not to make it technical. It was more technical than some of the others, which, it was just useful information, especially bringing the innovations from the taller buildings into the London-style office blocks. That's something I've sort of thought about over the years with developers, but they've never had the bottle to try it. So if Julian's managed to persuade someone to have a look at it, that's pretty good.
It was very interesting. Lifts aren't my particular field of speciality, but some interesting insights and learned some interesting things. Yeah, it was worthwhile. Nice and humorous as well, well guided.